Good afternoon. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. Today, as part of Miami University Alumni Association's webinar series, we present cybersecurity and elections. Joining us for today's webinar is Dr. James Walden, founding director of the Center for Cybersecurity and professor of computer science and software engineering here at Miami, as well as Professor Emeritus Dr. Jim Kuiper. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being here to talk about this particularly timely and relevant topic. We are glad to have you. As a reminder to our live viewers, you can submit a question by clicking the Ask a Question button under your video during the webinar. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim and James to get us started with a little information about cybersecurity this election season. Welcome.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.
In this spring season, we're really lucky to have Dr. James Walden with us. He did his Ph.D. at Carnegie Mellon in physics. After graduating from Miami in physics, I should say, by the way, so we're glad that he's an alumni coming home. He has had positions at University of Toledo and a longer stint at Northern Kentucky University. And just recently, we hired him here, professor of computer science, software engineering, and the director of the Center for Cybersecurity. Not only does he direct the center, he teaches in the department, and it was a really good hire for the department to hire him. Dr. Walden, could you tell us a little bit about the Cybersecurity Center here at the university before we get into that important topic of election security? But to tell us a little bit about the Miami University Center for Cybersecurity, which you're the founding director and just recently started.
Certainly. Yeah, so the purpose of the Center for Cybersecurity is to offer a single point where we coordinate our cybersecurity efforts at Miami in education, outreach, and research. We have 3 different degrees. In my department, we have a Bachelor of Science in Cybersecurity. In the College of Business, we have a degree in Cybersecurity Management. And at the regionals in the IT department, we have a Cybersecurity and Networking degree. And we've been learning to work together. My first year here, we're actually starting some projects with the city of Oxford itself to help them in some areas of cyber security. And we've also managed to get some grant funding for scholarships for cybersecurity students and to help set up our cyber range in the new cybersecurity lab, which is in the McVeigh Data Science building, which we just moved to in January.
That's great. You know, what I really like hearing is that this is not just a computer science software engineering center, it's a center for the university. So you've been able to incorporate other departments and really represent them well. And if anybody's ever worked in a university, you know that's not always easy to do. People tend to cling to their own ground, you know, and not want to share it with others. So I think it's great that you've been able to involve those, and each in their different ways. The degree in business, for example, what's the name of that degree again?
Information and Cybersecurity Management.
So they have kind of the management side of it, which makes sense. And CIT, which is on the regional campuses, what's the name of their degree?
It's Cybersecurity and Networking.
Again, kind of a different slant on it, that the computer science people, to be honest, aren't interested in that side as much. So it all works together well. How many students in each of those departments?
So 2 of the degrees just were approved this year. So it's about 30 students in each of those, and that includes our Bachelor of Science in Cybersecurity and the Cybersecurity and Networking degree. And there's somewhere in the high 50s for the Information Cybersecurity Management degree, which is a little bit older.
And you were telling me about the number of applications, because this is really the first class where we've actively our admissions department has actually pursued cybersecurity majors because we didn't have the major approved. How many applicants have you had? Has there been much demand for it?
Yeah, there's been a lot of demand. We've actually had about 400 applicants this year so far for the new degree.
That's great. Are there any clubs about, relating to cybersecurity?
Yes, we have a very active cybersecurity club. It's in its third year now. We actually began starting teaching the classes in cybersecurity before the degree was offered. So the first and second year courses were offered before I got here, and this year we're offering the third year courses in the degree. And we've got quite a few people in the club. There's about 100 registered members, around 40 show up to each meeting. I help them, find guest speakers and such, but they're actually very self-organizing. So they plan out a schedule week by week across the semester with the various things they want to learn about cybersecurity or when they want guest speakers to come in. They also do about a dozen capture the flag cybersecurity competitions during the year as well.
Where are those? Because they're not all hosted in Miami.
Right. So many of those are online, but some are in person. They've actually gone to both UC and Ohio University recently.
For someone that's not up on that terminology, how does a capture the flag exercise work?
There's actually multiple types of them. There's the red team, blue team exercises where the red team does offense, the blue team does defense. You can, and there's a variety of ways that those work. In the Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition League, the students are always the blue team, and they have a red team consisting of cybersecurity professionals who are testing the security of the blue team networks. And then there's also the sort of what we call Jeopardy style ones, where you're given a set of challenges of varying difficulties in different areas. So they might give you an executable, and your job is to get the executable to give you a flag. But of course, they're not going to tell you how to log into it or anything like that. You'll have to figure that out on your own.
I know that when I was still in the department before I retired, one of the courses we approved was one from that Dr. Suman Bunia teaches about ethical hacking. I just find that the title interesting because you usually think of hacking as a negative. What's ethical hacking?
Yeah, so ethical hacking is basically learning offensive security techniques to improve your defenses. So large companies will actually have internal red teams that will do security assessments, that is ethical hacking of their own networks, and build a report identifying where their security is weak and needs to be improved and where it's strong. Smaller companies often outsource that and hire managed security services providers to do security assessments for them. And so some of those are large companies you have heard of, like IBM, and others are security specific companies that do that type of work. And we have had students do internships doing that, and one of them is actually planning to do that full time after he graduates next year.
You think there is a good job market for those students?
Yes, cybersecurity is a great job market. There's really a demand for more people than we can graduate. So, finding employment is pretty easy.
Yeah. You also have the cyber lab in the McVeigh Data Science Building, which the grand opening for that is this Thursday, I think. You're already teaching classes there this semester in the building.
Right.
I should recommend people, if they haven't seen the data science building, the McVeigh Data Science Building, you ought to come and visit. It's a wonderful building, lots of interesting technologies in it. What's in the cybersecurity lab?
Yeah, so the cybersecurity lab seats 6 tables of 6 students. each with dual monitor workstations, sort of similar that they would have if they were working in a security operations center. And each table also has a dedicated monitor on the wall to it where they can share their materials with the other students as a team exercise. And as the instructor, you can also display to those or bring a display from any computer up to the main screen in the room. There's also attached to it is a locked data center, which is where our cyber range is located. We're still in the processes of setting that up since we just moved in January.
So that's basically on a private cloud, so that you don't have to worry about doing real hacking.
Right. It's important to have an isolated network when you're doing hacking exercises or if you're reverse engineering malware and things like that.
Good. Well, let's get into the topic for the day. That is election security. I know you're an expert in that area. So can you tell us some about it? What are the greatest risks? How do hackers get to what parts of the election concern you, for example?
Okay, let me actually go to my slides for this.
Sure.
So can we go to the next slide? So to really understand the security needs of voting, we need to understand what the whole process is. And one question that people used to ask a lot, I haven't heard it for a while, was, well, if we can bank over the internet, why can't we vote over the internet? And part of that is the security requirements are very different for banking versus voting. Voting's been around since at least ancient Greece. Early voting was either voice-based. They were still using that in the early days of the United States. The Greeks actually invented the ballot, which is a clay or stone token to represent a vote. Black ballots are negative votes on an issue, white are positive votes. Can we go to the next slide? Paper ballots have been around for a long time, but initially people just brought a scrap of paper and wrote down their votes on it. Later, political parties in the US would publish their own ballots, and of course, they would only list their own candidates. But Australia introduced the standardized paper ballot, where it would be distributed at the polls, it would be created by the government, it would list all political parties and candidates for everything people were voting on. And another innovation was that it was marked in secret to prevent people from pressuring the voter to vote a certain way. And after fraud claims in the 1884 election, the US started widely adopting the Australian paper ballot. It's still not perfect, though. There are arguments about, it's like, if you look at that example there, should there be an X in a box when you vote for something, a check? What if people vote for both parties in a race, and things like that? So it's not a perfect solution, but it was an improvement.
So James, I'm suspecting that the two circles at the top by Republican and Democrat means you could just make a mark there and vote the straight party ticket. Is that the idea?
Possibly. Although that introduces more potential ballot interpretation issues, like what if you put one of those and also fill in for a candidate? What does that mean?
In my lifetime, there were ballots that allowed you to vote the straight party ticket, which I'm glad we're no longer using.
Some states still have those.
Do they?
Yeah, can we go to the next slide? And so to try to make ballots more clear, the US moved to mechanical voting machines, which would punch a hole in a paper card. And so that way you wouldn't have to worry about, was it an X, was it a check mark? Did they fill in the ballot correctly, entirely? Did they do, fill in two different candidates for the same race and such? But mechanical machines have their own problems, most notably, as we found out in 2000, where the voters of America got an education in things like hanging chads, as you see there in the image, where you have the interpretation issue of Well, it's not punched all the way through because, as you see in the other image, there were so many people voting that the place where the chads were supposed to end up ended up being full, so the lever couldn't punch all the way through. And so how do you interpret a hanging or pregnant chad there? So that led to the Help America Vote Act in 2002. Which is when we started heavily moving to computerized voting machines.
The
Can we go to the next slide?
The terminology we gained there was kind of interesting. I particularly like the pregnant Chad.
Right, Chads, yes. So to think about security, we normally focus on the 3 CIA properties: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And all of these play a role in elections. So confidentiality, voters have the right to keep their ballots secret and also should not have the ability to prove the contents of their ballots in order to avoid coercion. And we've certainly actually seen that from many times over the years, employers actually blatantly saying, like, I want you to vote for this particular candidate. But fortunately, there's no way that a voter can prove that with modern systems. Second, integrities. Voters should be able to prove to themselves that their ballot was cast as intended and counted, and that the final tally is accurate. Finally, availability. Voters should be able to vote when they reach the polling place. And this is really the property that prevents internet voting, because it is incredibly easy to do denial of service attacks. It's very easy to prevent an election. And you might think, well, again, why is the bank different from voting? Well, the bank is open, 5 days a week, most weeks of the year. But voting is usually a one-day event. Maybe there's a few days of early or later voting, but you just don't have time to respond to a denial of service attack to handle it in that short of a time span. And it's very easy for attackers to muster the resources to keep a site down for a week or two. Also, most state networks, do not compare to, major corporate networks, which are much more resistant. If you're, say, Google or someone where you've got a large cloud infrastructure, they have enough network availability across the world. They're pretty resistant to it. But, say the state of Ohio doesn't have that level of resources.
That's interesting. I would have thought that that the internet would make voting more available, but I hadn't thought of the denial of service and those other issues that would, or even just a storm comes through and knocks out your internet for
right
a particular day. That would be a problem.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Sorry, a bit of a graphics glitch when this moved to this video framework. But this is a really key point, is that attackers have limited resources. There's actually an entire subfield of the economics of cybersecurity. And because they have limited resources, they will target the weakest link. So you have to secure the entire election process as a defender. They will choose attacks that have the biggest impact. So if they have the opportunity to choose between an attack that affects one person's vote or one polling place versus a whole county or state, they'll go for the larger impact. And they'll also choose attacks that impose the lowest risk. So they don't want to come in person to a polling place where they can be arrested to do an attack. They would much prefer to do attacks over the internet remotely where they're not exposed to risks like that. Okay, next slide. And so this is an illustration of the entire election infrastructure. This diagram comes from the federal government CISA agency that handles cybersecurity, both of the federal government, but also they help with things like elections, and also they help with critical infrastructure like utilities and so forth. So yeah, the first step is registration. Voters need to be registered to vote. Data from the registration database needs to be transferred to poll books at the various precincts where people vote, so you can verify that people who are allowed to vote there vote and no one else. And we also have the voting machines, and it can be interfered with as early as preparing the ballots, preparing the voting machine for use that year, or during the actual use of the voting machine. Once you have the ballots, you need to count them. That's the tabulation step. There's precinct level tabulation, central, and then state level tabulation. So there's multiple steps there. And then there's, of course, presenting the results of the election. So interfering in any of those areas is potentially a problem. So let's go to the next slide and look at our first step, voter registration. This is, in many ways, the best target. There are only 50 voter registration databases for the states, plus the DC has one, and the various territories have them for the things they can vote in, which does not include presidential elections, though. And the voter registration database there's not only a small number of them that affect a very large number of people each, so it's a great target from that perspective, high impact. It's also an easy target because it is connected to the internet. We have things like motor voter laws. That means the DMV network needs to be connected to the voter registration database. The Bureau of Vital Statistics to track when people die, move out of state, and such. They're also often connected to other states' databases. So again, checking for people moving and such. So there's a lot of different internet connections to a voter registration system, and all of those have to be defended to prevent attacks on it.
Now, what could someone do if they hack the voter registration system? I guess I'm trying to see how that could affect an election. So I guess I can say you could deny people the access. Is that the goal?
Right. You could do a massive availability database, just delete it. And there are worries, certainly ransomware attacks have happened on a lot of local governments. Locally in Ohio, the city of Huber Heights was hit in the fall. And even if the ransomware doesn't particularly care about voting, if they're just trying to shut down the state IT network to get a ransom, that can cause lack of availability if it's at the wrong time.
Does the data stored there, does it have any indication of how you voted in the past? What I'm getting at is, suppose you wanted to bias the vote for Democrats or Republicans or whatever, so you could can you look at their past history and say, okay, I'm going to delete everybody?
No, that data isn't stored anywhere.
So there's no way of knowing how people are leaning.
You can get an indication by what party they're registered for.
Okay.
But you don't know what party they were registered for at the last election.
And is there any data about race or ethnicity or anything else stored?
It depends on the state whether they collect that or not and keep it there. Really, there isn't a big confidentiality threat there. Most of these are public records anyway. Probably the biggest threat is integrity. Someone can alter people's voting records and potentially make it impossible for people to vote on voting day. They can, mess with your address or something, so you're registered in the wrong precinct and you don't know about that. Mm-hmm. They can, just delete your record entirely as well. So if you do like targeted deletions, you could do that to sway the outcome of an election, based on either, you do know their party registration, and you do also know their locations. And so you can estimate like, well, this district usually goes towards, one party there by this percentage. So if I can eliminate that many people from that party, then you can sway an election.
And I sometimes hear about supposedly dead people voting. Are there is one attack to be able to go in and someone who's been marked as dead to resurrect them?
Oh, unmark them. I've never heard of that. To do that, you need to do in-person voting fraud at the voting machine, which is much more risky there. Really, I guess, the number one reason you see dead people voting is that people die between the time they voted and between the candidate is sworn into office.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, next slide. Actually, go ahead to the next slide. I've already talked about that. So, we talked about confidentiality. There may be some private data, but your big risks are really the integrity, where people can potentially remove people from voting or alter their records so they're not qualified to vote, and for availability attacks. Next slide. And this is the one area of the voting system where we've seen actual attacks. In 2018, they started with 21 states, but they eventually found that every voter registration database had been hacked into by Russian state hackers. There's no evidence that they modified anything. Unfortunately, no evidence is not necessarily means that nothing happened. But another worry is just simply the fact that this happened can be enough to cause people to distrust the voting system.
Yeah, so it's hard to understand what hacking into that would have done. I don't know what could they have done that would have affected things, and what was their motivation?
Yeah, we don't know for sure. Certainly, again, the denial of service or removing voters, could be used to sway election results. In those cases, you would notice, like abnormal numbers of provisional ballots and such, and we didn't see that.
Yeah, perhaps what you've identified as the reason, just to undermine our sense of confidence in our democracy.
Right. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So, registration data is distributed in poll books, which historically really were books, but today are basically computers. Go ahead to the next slide. From the attacker perspective, it's exactly the same data as was in the registration database. The threats are all the same. It's just the poll book affects a smaller number of people. Potentially might be easier to attack. They are networked. They're not supposed to be connected to the internet, but they are connected to each other with a local wireless network. But again, you can only affect a single precinct at a time, so it's generally not a big target. Okay, next.
If you wanted to make a substantial difference, you'd have to go to lots of different precincts and
right
for those. And the question is, what are you doing? Making so people couldn't vote. This has nothing to do with the actual votes. It's just who's allowed to vote.
Right. And if you did take them out entirely, you could cause a denial of service attack at particular precincts. And so if you know that precinct usually goes, against the way you want the race to turn out, you can target those precincts with denial of service. Okay, next slide.
We haven't seen that in any great deal, have we?
We haven't, no. So now we're actually moving to casting ballots. And this XKCD cartoon illustrates pretty much how we think about voting. If you talk to, aeronautical engineers, they'll tell you aircraft are very safe. Mechanical engineers will tell you elevators are very safe. And if you talk to experts in cybersecurity, they will tell you computerized voting is incredibly unsafe, and we probably shouldn't be doing it. Okay, next slide. So attacks on voting machines. So again, our scale is going down. So if you affect a single voting machine, you may increase the amount of time that people take to vote. and you may be able to do things like swap who they voted for. So the screen says you voted for George Washington, but it records that you voted as Benedict Arnold. And of course, there's the usual denial of service attack possibility there. Okay, next slide. In-person voting fraud is very rare. The penalties are severe. You have to be there, which is dangerous. And audits find, very, very small numbers. And I do try to track these in the news after every election. And there's always people who try. Often they'll try to vote as a family member, where they have access to their ballot or something. Actually, there was a somewhat amusing incident where the son of one of the governor Virginia candidates actually tried to vote, even though he was 17, multiple times. But he wasn't eligible to vote, and they caught him each time. And also, voting fraud in person, voting one extra time doesn't really tend to sway the results of an election. Maybe for a local city council in a small town, a couple extra votes can matter, but certainly for president of the US and probably not for Congress either is this going to really have any effect.
So you're talking about the fraud where someone comes in and does something, votes when they should. And maybe you have another slide about this, but what about now that machines themselves are not connected to the internet, so you couldn't, there doesn't make sense to, someone in Russia or someplace else to be attacking a whole bunch of our voting machines. That's not going to happen. I guess, though, the question would be about the integrity of the machines themselves.
Right. So as we'll see, the voting machines are just Windows machines. Their USB ports are supposed to be hidden. There are some very nice USB hacking devices where if I can stick that into a USB device on your screen, it'll run some software and silently take over your whole computer. And but you are in a private, secluded area when you're using the voting machine. So potentially someone could pull off an attack like that and subvert a single voting machine by going in there with one of those USB hacking devices and take it over to do something, like flip votes or something like that.
That would just be that one voting machine, which maybe 100 people use that one day. So
right, it's still a small impact for that attack and very high risk.
Yeah, you'd have to do that to lots of different voting machines, that particular attack. Okay,
next slide. So the Help America Vote Act was well intended, but it had some problems. Just from an IT perspective, it provided one-time funding for new voting machines. And then there's the question of, well, how do you replace these when, warranties usually don't last more than 5 years for PCs, and that's all these are. What was worse, though, there were absolutely no cybersecurity requirements in the Help America Vote Act. And as a result, the initial voting software was of very poor quality. We saw things like integer overflows where it would count upwards to a certain point, and then as computer integers do, if you add one to the highest integer the computer supports, it will return to the lowest negative integer. Now the nice thing about that sort of quality problem, at least it happened, because if you see a negative number of votes, like that's probably an integer overflow if you know about computer issues. But just the fact they had obvious errors sort of meant you worried about how many non-obvious errors did they have in them.
James, you said that most of the machines are based on Windows, a Windows environment. Are they? I mean, for example, the overflow isn't going to be a problem on more modern 64-bit machines because the number of the size of the integer, gets much larger than we need. So are they?
You can use 64-bit integers now, which you would never reach that number of votes, but unfortunately, people still try to save space by using small integers in languages that support them.
Mm, mm. Short ends. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. There's a few different types of electronic voting machines. There's optical scan machines, which just count ballots. Basically, that you give them those Scantron forms that we're all used to seeing. There's ballot marking devices, and all they do is mark ballots. So you can pair a ballot marking device with an optical scanner and not worry about someone who put the pencil mark outside of the oval or something. So ballot marking devices help with that. They also help with accessibility because they can read a ballot for people with visual impairment. They can display the ballot in multiple languages and so forth. Unfortunately, though, right after the Help America Vote Act was passed, they went straight to DRE, direct recording electronic machines, where they record the votes on an internal flash memory device. And then when they went around to count them, they removed the flash memory devices and put those in the tabulating machine. There's a lot of problems with that. The most obvious is that, yeah, there's no way to verify that your vote was recorded as intended. Again, like the screen showed you voting for George Washington, but the malicious software on the voting machine recorded on the memory stick that you voted for Benedict Arnold. Okay, next slide. And yeah, voting machines really are just PCs and slightly different packages with touch screens. They pretty much all run Windows. Microsoft issues security updates for about 100 vulnerabilities every month. And because of the unusual use patterns of voting machines, that's somewhat more of a problem. Voting machines are typically taken out and used once or twice a year. And they're not supposed to be connected to the internet, so they're not going to be picking up updates then as well. And then once they're put in use, well, before they're put in use, you have to configure a ballot on each machine. And so you often take that via memory card or USB drive. There are malicious software like worms that can spread that way, so that is a worry there. You do want these machines to be secure, because that's one way you could affect like all the voting machines in a particular area, is that if you infected the ballot configuration, master USB drive, the malicious software gets copied into all the duplicates, and everyone who configures the ballot in that area infects them. Now, ballots are configured very locally, though, because they have local races as well as state level races. To get security updates to them, they are connected to an isolated network where a dedicated Windows update machine, which picked up the updates off the internet, is installed on that particular network, and that updates them. This does offer a small window of opportunity to affect multiple voting machines. If you can compromise that Windows update server, you can potentially compromise all the voting machines that are being updated at that point in time. But as we'll see in a couple of slides, it's still fairly difficult to pull something like that off because of the diversity of our voting hardware. Next slide, please. DEF CON is the premier hacking convention, happens in Las Vegas every summer. And they have these hacking villages where they focus on specific things. So there's like an automotive hacking village. And in 2017, they added an election hacking village. And so they buy all these used voting machines and tabulation machines and electronic poll books and so forth. And every year they hack all of them. Which does not say good things about the security of voting hardware. Okay, next slide. But actually, one of our biggest defenses is that our voting systems are quite diverse. Some states do require that every county use the same voting machines, but as you see from the map, other states do not. There are literally hundreds of different types of voting machines. And of course, even a single type, there's a bunch of different software versions and so forth. So it's not realistic to make something that hacks every voting machine. You have to get very targeted. And again, that if you need to target multiple types of voting machines, that dramatically increases the cost of, you need to have researchers who find exploits, you need to have programmers who develop malware and so forth. So there's a lot of cost to trying to hack even a single state's voting machines there. Okay, next. Mail-in ballots were a big issue in 2020. And I did want to handle this here because this is an alternative to voting machines. Mail-in ballots are often counted by optical scanners, but you're not using a machine. The main issues were mostly mistakes where they printed something wrong in the ballot. And of course, that can happen in a general election too, in person. The only case I found where somebody was directly interfering was that a postal worker in Louisville, Kentucky, was actually collecting and throwing out a subset of ballots. And the story doesn't indicate how he chose which ones to throw out so that those people didn't get them. Basically, it's a denial of service attack. But he was caught doing that. Okay, next. So if we have all these security issues with voting machines, how can we ensure that our balloting process is secure? And the key thing is producing paper ballots, what we call a voter verified paper audit trail. So that is, you either fill in a paper ballot directly, or if you use a machine, the machine prints a ballot and allows the voter to check it before indicating that they accept the ballot. So this prevents the type of malware that would switch your vote from George Washington to Benedict Arnold, because you would see the vote switched on the printed ballot, and you have the opportunity to reject it then. Also, paper ballots allow for recounts, which direct recording electronic really doesn't. I mean, the software was required by the Help America Vote Act to have a recount function, but all it does is it just rereads the vote totals from the memory card. It's not an actual recount in any sense.
So in Ohio, in Butler County, in Oxford, when I go to vote, I have the machine, I make my selections, and then at the end I push a button and I see it printing out over here on the right. So that do they only look at that printed thing if there's a recount? Is that all it's for?
No, they actually only count the paper ballots.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the machine itself is just facilitating the printing of this paper, and then is that goes into some machine that reads that, scans it somehow, and
right, usually an optical scanner machine. Yeah.
The advice then to people around this part of Ohio that use that is we ought to be checking that as it goes by. Yes, that is exactly what I voted for.
Right. It doesn't work if you don't look at it. Yeah. That's true. Oh, and one thing to note, barcodes and QR codes are not voter verified paper audit trails because they are not humanly readable. And you can actually catch a virus by scanning a QR code. So I really dislike them overall.
Oh,
I'm not sure why they have become really popular in the last year or so. I was so happy when they initially came out and quickly faded away. Okay, next slide. So, well, it takes a lot of resources to do a recount of all the ballots. And so what states have begun introducing is a statistical procedure called a risk limiting audit, where you take a random sample of ballots from every race, every issue, and you count those and you perform a statistical test, sort of like a t-test. And the state law will say, this, you need to start with a random sample of this size, and you need, say, 99.5% confidence. What if you don't reach that level of confidence? Then the risk limiting audit procedure will actually instruct you on what size of a sample to take next. You recount that larger sample, do the test again. eventually, if you never reach the confidence interval, the risk limiting audit procedure will lead to a recount of everything. But because the initial random samples are pretty small, it doesn't really require a lot of effort to check every race within a fairly high degree of confidence, and you've got a procedure if you don't reach that confidence to attain certainty. Ohio is piloting risk limiting audits, as are some other states. And that map's a little out of date. I couldn't find a more recent map. I think that's the 2021, but it is being more and more widely adopted.
You know, I think to those of us that appreciate statistics, I think that is reassuring to have that happen. I do wonder about the general population, which perhaps doesn't understand statistical tests as often and as much, and the power of them, if that helps their level of confidence or not. But it does me. So
that's good. And so, yeah, really no matter, if your voting machine's infected and is flipping votes and such, we have the voter verified paper audit trail to detect it in the first place. But even if the voter doesn't notice it, it will produce a noticeable skew in the election results, with the risk limiting audit should be able to show us. That doesn't mean we should ignore the security of voting machines. And we'll talk about some ways that states like Ohio have been improving that. And given our time, let me go ahead and, can you skip over the slides for tabulation? Yeah, it's pretty similar to the others. Yeah, they're just PCs too, and similar problems there. So basically, what do we need for secure voting? We need the voter verified paper audit trail. We need risk limiting audits. We need to require that vendors have a high standard cybersecurity, and we need to provide cybersecurity services like vulnerability management, intrusion detection, and such for election boards, because they just don't have the staff to do that themselves. Fortunately, the CISA has started providing a lot of those services for free, and Ohio law has started requiring that we do those things. So let's go to the next slide. So CISA is a fairly recent government agency, just from 2018. But they have been doing a lot, both in producing documentation, but also producing tools and services and alerts of current threats. So they've been a tremendous help to every state's election security. Next slide. The voluntary voting system guidelines were released in 2005 to try to improve security, but they were extremely weak. And so a lot of states do require them, but really they don't accomplish much. But version 2.0, which was released quite recently in 22, does provide fairly strong security requirements for voting machines. And you have to, as a voting vendor, you don't have to get it accredited, but if state law says you have to, you're not going to sell any voting machines in that state if they say you have to, go to one of the labs to get accredited under this version of the VBSG. Next slide. And so this is Ohio. There's a lot of different types of voting machines there, as you can see. Next slide. Currently, all Ohio counties use paper ballots, either marked by hands or marked by a ballot marking device voting machine. So this ensures that Ohio always has a voter verified paper audit trail, which is a great thing to have. Not all states have this. Next. Physical security. State law requires that voting equipment be stored in a secure climate-controlled location. There's a dual control lock, which requires a bipartisan team to gain access to voting machines. There's a requirement to have a security alarm system and have a service monitoring that. accesses to voting machines are recorded in a log. And there's periodic inventories with chain of custody requirements there. There are similar physical security requirements for ballots, the paper ballots after they're cast, and other election data. Next. There's also password security requirements, including the BIOS password. So most of you probably haven't set BIOS passwords on your computer systems, but when you first boot up, you can go into the firmware that handles the first step of the voting process. And it's important to control that, because if you have access to the BIOS, you can do things like tell it, boot from this operating system on a USB stick, which I, the hacker, control, and therefore when the system boots up like that, I have access to everything as administrator because I was able to boot using an OS I controlled. So BIOS passwords stop that. And there's also password requirements for tabulation software and so forth. Okay, next.
Hey, James.
Question? Yeah.
We're running out of time here, and there's a couple of questions I'd like you to address. This is all
Okay.
good stuff, but
Yeah.
These are questions from some of the listeners. One asks, were there any credible cyber attacks during either the 2016 or 2020 presidential election?
There were not any attacks recorded in 2016. In 2020, some state voter registration databases were attacked again, but again, it seems like there were no alterations done there. We couldn't find any evidence of that either on computers or through an abnormal number of provisional ballots, as you'd expect.
All right, that's good to hear. Another question here is, how might blockchain technology enhance election security?
Okay, can you move the slides ahead to the blockchain slide? It's after the extra slide. There we are. Okay. So really, blockchains solve a very different problem than we're trying to solve in elections. So basically, the blockchain is a decentralized, immutable ledger system. But it does depend on the security of the client program. And we've certainly seen the various blockchain software be attacked. And we've also seen the blockchain software change because people want to change how blockchains work. Like, for example, there was the big fork where they produced two versions of Bitcoin over. They wanted to increase the size of blocks, and so they ended up having two different types of software handling that. Blockchain provides tamper detection, but doesn't offer a way to recover from that tampering. Also, we don't want voters to be able to be identified. Blockchains are not anonymous, they're pseudonymous. So every transaction is carefully tracked, and law enforcement has gotten very good at doing that type of tracking and calling back stolen funds from ransomware gangs and the like. There's also the issue of people voting on paper or via mail-in ballots or in person, and how do you handle that as a computer transaction? Finally, blockchains, and the vast majority of them are incredibly slow. They handle a very small number of transactions per second. They just don't handle enough transaction to scale to a federal level election on election day either. So yeah, it's just really the wrong security model for elections.
Would it be helpful? I'm thinking about updating the software on machines, on the voting machines. I wonder if blockchain could help guarantee that the right version of the software that someone wasn't hacking that way.
Yeah, so blockchain does use an underlying technology called digital signatures, which software updates also use. So like every Windows update, the Windows Update software checks the digital signature to verify the update really came from Microsoft. and that is a legitimate software. So code signing has been around for a long time and is definitely in use on any Windows system and almost every software update system already. Yeah.
Another listener asked a question that, let me get your view on it. Purging voter rolls has been a problem in the past. I'm not sure how this can be stopped with cybersecurity, but it's a real concern. I'll let you talk about that.
Yeah. So these are the official voter purges that states do. And the idea is that you're removing people who moved out of state or who died and so forth. And of course, those are necessary processes. The problem is that we've had incidents where, like, I think it was in Colorado, where a state election official was purging the votes from her own computer in her own home without anyone else there knowing who she purged or anything. And apparently they didn't have an audit system for that. So that's basically, I would call that like an insider cyber attack, and cybersecurity can help with that by ensuring that there is an audit trail that is preserved. There's multiple copies of it, is preserved in a way that the election officials can't affect that. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of political motivation around purges. Probably the worst example was Florida in 2000, where the state chose the highest bidder who offered to do the worst matches. The other companies offered to do a Social Security card match, whereas the company that won the bid charged more, but matched on 80% of the name and 80% of the birth date. And that means, if somebody, say I'm James Walden, and say if there was a J Wald, that might be close enough for them if our birth dates were only off by one digit. And so they had a very large voting pool. They had very high numbers of provisional ballots. They didn't end up counting all of those because the Supreme Court ended counting ballots. So
they were purging when two names were very similar. Well, not really that similar. 80% weren't even their birth dates. Didn't have to match exactly.
Right.
Matched, kind of. Maybe they're off by a year or something. That was sufficient to purge. It's interesting.
Yeah, one digit can be off anywhere, I think. So,
well, we're almost finished here. We do have an important election coming up in the fall. What is your sense of confidence in the election? Do you think it will be a fair election? I know that there always are people trying to cheat. That's going to happen. But in a way, is it going to happen in a way? Are there enough security checks in that it won't happen in a way that's sufficient to change the overall outcome, or not?
Yeah. In terms of cybersecurity, I'm quite confident for certain states like Ohio and Kentucky that have done a lot of these procedures, so that they have voter verified paper audit trails, they have risk limiting audits, they've follow the higher levels of the voluntary voting system guidelines, they have intrusion detection and vulnerability management provided by CISA and such to help. Unfortunately, not every state is at that level of security yet. There's a website called Ballotopedia, and they do track some of the security aspects, not everything. You really do have to dig into your state's Secretary of State's office and also the legislature, and you should be able to fairly easily find for bills and standards that will describe the cybersecurity standards for your state, but it does differ completely from state to state. Probably the main worry is the usual ones of things like voting purges that are too broad and potentially resulting in provisional ballots not being counted, long lines, so denying availability in that way. Which again is one of the additional problems computerized voting gives us, because computers, do fail even when they're not attacked. They're not really designed to be pulled out and used once or twice a year. That's not really the life cycle. And of course, poorer counties and states have difficulty replacing those voting machines too.
Good. Well, thank you, James. Could you pull up I should have warned you this ahead of time, pull up the website for the center just so people can see that in case they want to learn more about
Yeah.
what you're doing.
Just a second here.
I should have warned you about that earlier.
Yeah, the quick URL is miamioh.edu/cyber. And let me go and share my screen. There we are. Okay, so you should have that now.
That's the URL. Can you show the screen? Yeah, okay, there you go. Yep, thank you. Good.
Yeah, and if you scroll down or get the quick links, you can see the faculty and staff involved in the center. If we scroll down, we see the different cybersecurity majors, not managers. You can learn about the Cybersecurity Club and learn about some local resources in cybersecurity as well.
Great. Well, thank you, James. This is interesting and a very important topic for this at this time.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak on it.
Good. And welcome back to Miami.
Thank you.
Molly?
Oh, thank you so much for this good information. I think it's really good for voters to have this sort of baseline level of comfort with the security of our election, seeing as it's been called into question either reasonably or unreasonably as often as it has been over the last several years. So thank you for sharing that really, really excellent sort of foundational knowledge for sort of us laymen's out here who are just casting votes. So we do appreciate that. Thank you again for sharing with us, both of you, for sharing your time. As a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be available on our website later today. You can see this and all of our other webinar presentations at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Thank you all for joining us. Happy lead up to the election season, and love and honor to everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.